The water knew before Affiano did that something was wrong. It sat in the glass, clear and innocent, while the most feared man in Naples discovered he could no longer swallow. The glass trembled against Affiano Calabresi's lips, water refusing to pass his throat like his body had forgotten how to swallow. The private clinic room felt sterile and cold, all white walls and the sharp scent of antiseptic that reminded him why he despised doctors. His hand, the same hand that had signed death warrants without hesitation, shook as he set the glass down on the metal table with a soft clink that echoed his humiliation. "It's psychological," Dr. Moretti had said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses nervously. "Your body is rejecting hydration due to trauma response. We see this sometimes in—" Affiano had walked out before the man could finish his diagnosis. He didn't need some university-trained fool telling him his mind was broken. He knew that already. The condition had started 6 months ago, the morning after he'd finally cleaned out Lucia's belongings. 23 years she'd been gone, and he'd kept her clothes hanging in their bedroom closet like she might walk through the door any moment, demanding to know why he'd moved her favorite perfume. But that night, something had snapped. He'd torn through the room like a man possessed, stuffing dresses and jewelry into garbage bags until nothing remained but the faint scent of jasmine and the echo of her laughter. He'd woken the next morning with his throat sealed shut. The Naples heat hit him like a wall as he stepped onto the street, his black suit absorbing the afternoon sun. 6 months of this condition, 6 months of his empire watching their boss slowly dehydrate while pretending not to notice. His men flanked him at a respectful distance, their eyes scanning for threats while carefully avoiding his face. They'd learned not to comment on the untouched water bottles that accumulated in his car, his office, his home. Marco, his lieutenant, had suggested IV drips. "Just until we figure this out, boss." But Affiano refused to be seen with tubes in his arm like some dying hospital patient. He'd rather collapse in the street than show that kind of weakness. Power was perception, and perception was everything in his world. The street buzzed with typical Italian chaos, vendors calling out prices, motor scooters weaving between cars, tourists clutching guidebooks. Affiano moved through it all like a ghost, his throat burning with each breath. Every fountain they passed mocked him. Every cafe with its clinking glasses felt like a personal insult. He thought of Lucia constantly now, more than he had in years. The way she used to hum while cooking, her voice floating through their apartment like incense. The lullabies she'd sung when she was pregnant, her hand resting on her swollen belly while she planned their future. A future that had burned to ash in a hospital fire orchestrated by his enemies. The guilt lived in his throat now, he realized, choking him slowly. Then he heard it. A voice, soft but cracked with exhaustion, drifting from somewhere near the curb. Not the polished tones of the opera singers who performed in the piazzas, but something raw and honest that cut through the city noise like a blade. Affiano stopped walking. His bodyguards noticed immediately, their hands instinctively moving toward their jackets. But their boss wasn't looking for threats. He was staring at a girl, maybe 16, sitting on a piece of cardboard with a dented guitar case open beside her. Her clothes were too big, her dark hair unwashed, but her voice was pulling something from deep in his chest. The melody was simple, wordless, just pure sound that seemed to reach into places he'd forgotten existed. It reminded him of something, a half-remembered dream, a song from another lifetime. The girl's eyes were closed as she sang, her face tilted toward the sun like she was drawing strength from its warmth. Without thinking, Affiano reached for the water bottle his driver always carried. His throat opened. The liquid flowed down smooth as silk, cool and perfect, while her melody wrapped around him like a forgotten lullaby. For the first time in months, he could drink. The sensation was so shocking he nearly choked. Water, simple, life-giving water, sliding down his throat without resistance, without the crushing weight of guilt that had sealed him shut for half a year. He drank deeply, desperately, while the girl continued her song, unaware that she was performing a miracle. When the bottle was empty, he stood there gasping, water dripping from his chin. The girl's song faded, and immediately he felt his throat begin to close again, the familiar tightness returning like a fist around his windpipe. He stared at her, this orphan child with her threadbare clothes and broken guitar case, and felt something shift in his chest, not just relief, but recognition, as if some part of him had been waiting his entire life to hear that particular voice. His men exchanged worried glances. Passers-by gave them a wide berth, sensing the dangerous stillness that surrounded their group. But Affiano barely noticed. He was studying the girl's face, the curve of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, something familiar in the tilt of her head. "Boss?" Marco's voice was carefully neutral. "Everything all right?" Affiano didn't answer. He couldn't explain what had just happened because he didn't understand it himself. All he knew was that for 6 months, water had been his enemy. And this girl, this stranger with her broken voice and empty guitar case, had somehow made peace between them. He turned to look at her one more time before his men ushered him toward the waiting car. She'd opened her eyes and was watching him with curiosity rather than fear. Most people looked at Affiano Calabresi and saw death walking in an expensive suit. But this girl just looked at him like he was another lost soul on a Naples street corner. Water still on his lips, he slid into the back seat of his Mercedes. And for the first time in years, Affiano Calabresi, the man who controlled half of Naples' underworld, wasn't in control of anything at all. As the car pulled away from the curb, he found himself already planning his return. Not because he understood what had happened, but because he knew with absolute certainty that he would die without hearing that voice again. The water had taught him that much. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story unfolds darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than you think. Now, let's begin the tale. Affiano returned the next morning like a man drawn to his own execution. He told himself it was curiosity, a successful businessman investigating an anomaly, but as his Mercedes crawled through the narrow streets toward yesterday's corner, his hand trembled around an unopened water bottle, and he knew he was lying. The girl wasn't there. He sat in the back seat for 20 minutes, scanning every doorway and alley while Marco shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. The empty patch of sidewalk where she'd sung mocked him. His throat began to close again, that familiar crushing sensation returning like an old enemy. "Boss, maybe we should find her." The words came out as a rasp. Marco's reflection met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Sir?" "The girl. From yesterday. Find her." It took his men 3 hours to locate her in a bombed-out building near the port, sharing space with a handful of other street kids who scattered like roaches when Affiano's men appeared. She didn't run, just sat cross-legged on a moldy mattress, tuning her guitar with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. "You're the man who drinks," she said when Affiano stepped through the doorway, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass. He studied her in the dim light filtering through cracked windows. 16, maybe 17, dark eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. A small scar on her left wrist that caught his attention for reasons he couldn't name. "I need you to sing." She tilted her head, considering. Why? The question caught him off guard. In his world, people didn't ask why. They simply obeyed or faced consequences. But this girl looked at him with genuine curiosity, as if his answer actually mattered to her. "Because I can't drink without it." That's not an answer. That's a symptom. Smart. Too smart for someone living in ruins. "What's your name?" "Maria." She strummed a chord, the sound echoing off the broken walls. "And you're Affiano Calabresi." He shouldn't have been surprised she knew. His face appeared in newspapers often enough, usually in articles about alleged criminal activity and ongoing investigations. But hearing his name from her lips felt different, not fearful or reverent, just factual. "You know who I am, yet you're not afraid. Should I be?" Another question that had no easy answer. He was a man who solved problems with violence, who built his empire on fear and respect. But standing in this ruined building, watching this girl tune her guitar with steady hands, he felt more like a supplicant than a king. "Sing for me," he said again. "No." The word hung in the air between them. Marco's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but Affiano raised a finger to stop him. Violence wouldn't work here. He could feel it in his bones. "Why not?" "Because you're asking for the wrong reasons." Mireia set down her guitar and looked at him directly. "You want me to fix something broken inside you, but I'm not a doctor. I'm just a girl who sings." "I'll pay you." "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face like she was reading a map. "I want you to listen. Really listen. Not just to my voice, but to what it's trying to tell you." Affiano felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time someone had made demands of him? When was the last time someone had looked past his reputation and seen something worth saving? "And if I listen, then maybe we can help each other." He didn't understand what she meant, but he found himself nodding. Mireia picked up her guitar again, her fingers finding the strings with practiced ease. The melody that emerged was different from yesterday, sadder, more complex. It spoke of loss and longing, of dreams deferred and love remembered. As her voice filled the broken space, Affiano felt his throat open like a flower blooming. He drank deeply from the water bottle, each swallow easier than the last. But this time, he paid attention to more than just the physical relief. He listened to the words she wove between the notes, the story her voice told without speaking. It was a lullaby. The same lullaby Lucia used to sing. The water bottle slipped from his hands, shattering on the concrete floor. Mireia's song faltered, then stopped entirely. She was watching him with those two knowing eyes, waiting for him to speak. "Where did you learn that song?" "I don't know. I've always known it." She set down her guitar carefully. "Why? Does it mean something to you?" Affiano's mind raced. The melody was exact. Every note, every pause, every subtle variation that Lucia had added to make it her own. But that was impossible. Lucia had been dead for 23 years, and this girl couldn't be more than 17. "My wife used to sing it," he said finally. "Used to?" "She died. A long time ago." Mireia nodded like this explained something important. "Maybe that's why you can't drink. Maybe your body is trying to hold on to something that's already gone." The observation hit him like a physical blow. This girl, this stranger living in ruins, had identified in minutes what teams of doctors couldn't diagnose in months. His throat wasn't rejecting water. It was rejecting the idea of moving forward, of living in a world without Lucia's voice. "Sing it again," he whispered. This time, when Mireia's voice filled the space, Affiano closed his eyes and let himself remember. Lucia's hands on her pregnant belly, her voice floating through their apartment, the future they'd planned before his enemies stole it away. When the song ended, he opened his eyes to find Mireia watching him with something that might have been compassion. "Better?" she asked. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good. Then maybe tomorrow you can tell me why that song makes you cry." As Affiano walked back to his car, Marco fell into step beside him. "Boss, this is dangerous. A man's weakness always has a name." Affiano paused at the car door, looking back at the ruined building where a girl with an impossible voice had just performed another miracle. "Yes," he said quietly, "it does." But as they drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mireia wasn't his weakness. She was his salvation. The apartment above the music studio wasn't charity, Affiano told himself as he signed the lease. It was positioning. He'd spent 3 days watching Mireia return to that bombed-out building, 3 days of driving past the ruins while his throat closed tighter each time she disappeared into the shadows. The other street kids had started to recognize his car, scattering like startled birds whenever the black Mercedes appeared. But Mireia always stayed, sitting cross-legged on her moldy mattress, waiting for him to work up the courage to ask for what he needed. On the 4th day, he'd had enough. "You can't live like this," he said, stepping through the doorway where broken glass crunched under his Italian leather shoes. Mireia looked up from her guitar, fingers still moving across the strings in a melody he didn't recognize. Like what? Like an animal. Animals have dens. I have a room with 3 walls and a view of the harbor. She gestured toward the gaping hole where a window used to be. Some people pay good money for waterfront property. Her humor caught him off guard. Most people in her situation would be bitter, desperate. But Mireia spoke about her circumstances with the detached observation of someone commenting on the weather. "I have a place," he said. "Small apartment, above a music studio in Chiaia. The previous tenant moved out last week." Moved out or disappeared? The question was asked casually, but Affiano caught the sharpness underneath. She knew exactly who he was and what that meant. Moved out. To Milan. For a recording contract. He paused. The studio owner is a friend. He won't ask questions. Mireia set down her guitar and studied his face. "What's the catch?" "No catch. There's always a catch with men like you." "Men like me?" "Men who solve problems with money and expect gratitude in return." Affiano felt something twist in his chest. She was right, of course. His entire life was built on transactions, loyalty bought with fear, respect purchased with violence, problems eliminated with cash. But standing in this ruin, watching this girl who had somehow unlocked his throat, he found himself wanting to give something without expecting anything in return. "The only thing I ask," he said carefully, "is that you continue to sing when I need it. And if I say no, then you say no." Mireia was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception. Finally, she nodded. "Show me." The apartment was small but clean. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living room with windows that actually had glass. The music studio below provided a constant backdrop of muffled melodies and scales, the sound of dreams being practiced into existence. "It's not much," Affiano said, watching Mireia explore the space with careful steps, as if she expected it to disappear. "It has a door that locks," she said, running her fingers along the deadbolt, "and a shower that works." She turned the bathroom faucet, watching water flow clear and steady. "It's perfect." Something in her voice made his chest tighten. When was the last time he'd heard someone express genuine gratitude for something so basic? In his world, people demanded penthouses and complained about thread counts, but Mireia looked at this modest apartment like he'd handed her a palace. "There's more," he said. Over the next week, Affiano found himself making arrangements he couldn't quite explain. A tutor for mathematics and literature, a vocal coach who specialized in classical technique, a doctor who made house calls and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about his patients' backgrounds. "You don't have to do this," Mireia said one afternoon, watching him review the tutor's credentials with Marco. "Do what?" "Try to turn me into something I'm not." Affiano looked up from the papers. "What do you think I'm trying to turn you into?" "A project, a charity case, something that makes you feel better about the things you've done." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth, but only a grain. "I'm trying to give you choices," he said. "Education opens doors. Training develops talent. These things give you options." "Options for what?" "For whatever you want to become." Mireia tilted her head, studying him with that unsettling directness. "And what if what I want to become is exactly what I already am?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Affiano realized he'd been operating under the assumption that her current life was something to be escaped from, improved upon. But looking at her now, confident, self-possessed, unbroken despite everything she'd endured, he wondered if he'd been wrong. "Then you use the education to become better at being yourself," he said finally. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges. "Okay," she said, "but I have conditions. Name them. I keep my guitar, I keep my voice the way it is, and I keep the right to say no." Agreed. That evening, Affiano sat in the apartment's small living room while Mireia made tea in the kitchen. The domestic normalcy of it felt foreign. When was the last time he'd simply sat in someone's home without bodyguards, without the weight of business pressing down on his shoulders? "Do you hear my voice clearly?" Mireia asked, emerging from the kitchen with 2 steaming cups. The question seemed important, though he couldn't understand why. "Always," he said. She handed him the tea and settled into the chair across from him. "Good. That matters." "Why?" But she was already reaching for her guitar, her fingers finding the familiar melody that opened his throat like a key turning in a lock. As her voice filled the small room, Affiano drank his tea and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: peace. When the song ended, Mireia set down her guitar and curled up in the chair, her eyes growing heavy. The day's lessons had exhausted her. Mathematics in the morning, vocal exercises in the afternoon, a doctor's appointment to address the malnutrition that had left her smaller than she should be. "I should go," Affiano said, starting to rise. "Stay," she said softly, already half asleep. "Just until I fall asleep. Sometimes the quiet gets too loud." So he stayed, watching over this girl who had somehow become the most important person in his world. As her breathing deepened and her face relaxed into sleep, Affiano found himself studying her features in the lamplight, something familiar in the curve of her jaw, something that made his chest tighten with recognition he couldn't quite name, but he didn't leave. Not yet. The dream always started the same way, with the smell of smoke and the sound of Lucia screaming. Affiano found himself running down endless hospital corridors, his feet echoing against polished floors that stretched into darkness. The walls were white, sterile, but blood seeped through the paint like watercolor bleeding through paper. Emergency lights flashed red, casting everything in the color of violence. "Where is she?" Lucia's voice echoed from somewhere ahead, raw with pain and terror. "Where is my baby?" He ran faster, his lungs burning, but the hallway stretched longer with each step. Doors lined the walls, some open, revealing empty rooms with rumpled beds and abandoned medical equipment. Others were locked, and behind them he could hear crying. Soft, infant crying that made his chest feel like it was caving in. The fire started small, just wisps of smoke curling under door frames, but it spread quickly, hungrily, consuming everything in its path. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and Affiano knew with dream logic certainty that he was running out of time. He burst through a set of double doors and found himself in a delivery room. Lucia was there, but wrong, her face pale as death, her dark hair matted with sweat and blood. She was reaching for something, someone. Her arms stretched toward a figure in surgical scrubs. "Give her back," Lucia sobbed. "Please give her back." The figure turned, and Affiano saw his face, Salvatore Torino, his oldest enemy, the man who had orchestrated this nightmare. In his arms was a bundle of blankets, and from within came the sound of crying. "She's mine now," Torino said, his voice echoing strangely. "Payment for your sins, Calabresi." The fire reached the room, flames licking at the walls, consuming the medical equipment, the bed, everything except the 3 figures frozen in this tableau of loss. Affiano tried to move, tried to reach for his wife, his child, but his feet were rooted to the floor. Lucia's eyes found his across the burning room. "You let them take her," she whispered, and her voice was full of a disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. "You let them take our daughter." The ceiling collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. Affiano threw his arms up to protect himself, and when he looked again, Lucia was gone. Torino was gone. Only the crying remained, growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely. He woke gasping, his shirt soaked with sweat, his throat sealed shut like a tomb. The nightmare had been coming more frequently since Mireia entered his life. Every night for the past week, the same sequence of images, the same crushing sense of failure. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the crying in the dream had sounded familiar. Affiano stumbled to his bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. 53 years old, and he looked every day of it. The salt and pepper at his temples had spread, and new lines had appeared around his eyes. The face of a man who had lived too long with too many regrets. But it was the dream that haunted him. Specifically, one detail that had never been clear before: the bundle in Torino's arms. Tonight, for the first time, he'd seen the baby's face. Dark eyes. A small scar on her left wrist where an IV had been inserted. Affiano's hands shook as he reached for his phone. "Marco," he said when his lieutenant answered on the second ring, "I need you to pull some files." "Boss? It's 3 a.m. "The hospital fire. 23 years ago. I want everything. Medical records, witness statements, casualty reports. Everything." There was a pause. "Sir, we went through all this years ago. Torino's people destroyed most of the evidence before—" "Not all of it." Affiano's voice was steady, but his heart was racing. "There are always records, insurance claims, backup files, something. Find them." "What exactly are we looking for?" Affiano closed his eyes, seeing again the bundle in Torino's arms, hearing the infant's cry that had sounded so much like Mireia's voice. "Missing," persons reports. Any babies unaccounted for after the fire. By morning, Marco had assembled a stack of files that painted a picture Affiano had never wanted to see clearly. The hospital fire had been chaos. Patients evacuated in the middle of the night, records scattered, families separated in the confusion. In the aftermath, several people had simply vanished, their fates lost in the bureaucratic maze of a healthcare system under attack. "Here," Marco said, sliding a folder across Affiano's desk. 3 infants reported missing after the fire. 2 were found within 48 hours, 1 with relatives, 1 in a different hospital. But this one— Affiano opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a birth certificate, partially burned but still legible. Baby girl, born at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the fire. Mother, Lucia Calabresi. Father, Affiano Calabresi. Status, missing, presumed dead. But there was more. A nurse's report filed weeks later when the chaos had settled. She'd seen a man in surgical scrubs carrying an infant toward the emergency exit during the evacuation. When questioned, he'd claimed to be transferring the baby to safety, but no transfer had been logged, and the man had never been identified. "The nurse," Affiano said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is she still alive?" "Retired, living in Sorrento." "But boss—" Marco hesitated. "Even if what you're thinking is true, it's been 23 years. The chances that—" "Get me her address." The drive to Sorrento took 2 hours, 2 hours during which Affiano's mind raced through possibilities he'd never dared consider. He'd mourned his daughter for over 2 decades, had built a shrine to her memory in his heart. But what if she hadn't died in the fire? What if Torino had taken her, hidden her, raised her in poverty as the ultimate revenge? What if she'd been singing on street corners, waiting for him to find her? The nurse, Maria Benedetti, was in her 70s now, her hair white as snow but her memory sharp as a blade. She invited Affiano into her small apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples, serving him espresso in delicate china cups while he explained why he'd come. "I remember that night," she said, her voice soft with old pain. "Worst thing I ever saw in 40 years of nursing. The fire, the chaos, families torn apart." "The baby," Affiano pressed gently. "My baby. You saw someone take her." Maria nodded slowly. Tall man, dark hair. "Said he was a doctor, but I'd never seen him before. He had your daughter wrapped in a blanket, said he was taking her to the children's hospital across town. But he didn't. No, I checked the next day. No infant matching her description was ever admitted." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I should have stopped him. Should have asked more questions. But everything was so chaotic, and he seemed so official." Affiano set down his espresso cup with a hand that shook only slightly. "Did you ever see him again?" "Once. Years later, at a funeral. Salvatore Torino's funeral." She looked at Affiano directly. He was one of the pallbearers. The drive back to Naples passed in a blur. Affiano's mind was reeling, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Torino had taken his daughter, but not to kill her. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he'd condemned her to a life of poverty and abandonment, ensuring that Affiano's child would grow up with nothing while her father built an empire on the ashes of his grief. But Torino was dead now, had been for 15 years, and somehow, impossibly, Mireia had found her way back to him. Not through planning or searching, but through the simple act of singing on a street corner, her voice calling to something deep in his DNA that recognized its own. That evening, Affiano sat in Mireia's apartment, watching her practice scales with her vocal coach. She caught him staring and smiled, that easy, unguarded expression that made his chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. "You're quiet tonight," she said after the coach left. "Just thinking." "About what?" Affiano looked at her, really looked at her. The dark eyes that matched his own, the stubborn set of her jaw that reminded him of Lucia, the small scar on her wrist that he now knew came from an IV inserted during the most traumatic night of both their lives. "About how sometimes the things we lose find their way back to us," he said. Mireia tilted her head, studying his face with that unsettling directness. "Is that what you think I am? Something you lost?" Affiano's throat closed, but not from his condition. From the weight of truth, he wasn't ready to speak. "I think," he said carefully, "that some songs are meant to be heard by specific people." She smiled and reached for her guitar. "Then let me sing you home." As her voice filled the small apartment, Affiano closed his eyes and let himself imagine a different world, one where he'd found her sooner, one where 23 years of separation had never happened, one where he could tell her the truth without destroying everything they'd built. But not tonight. Tonight, he would just listen to his daughter sing and pretend that the water on his cheeks was anything other than tears. The DNA test kit sat in Affiano's desk drawer like a loaded gun. He'd ordered it 3 days ago after spending sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, while Maria Benedetti's words echoed in his mind. Tall man, dark hair. Said he was a doctor. The pieces fit too perfectly to be coincidence, but Affiano had built his empire on facts, not hope. He needed proof before he could allow himself to believe what his heart already knew. The problem was getting a sample without Mireia's knowledge. "You're distracted," Marco observed, sliding a stack of reports across the desk. "The Torino investigation is stalling because you won't focus." Affiano looked up from the drawer he'd been staring into. "What did you find?" "Hospital records from the night of the fire. Took some convincing, but the administrator finally cooperated." Marco's expression was carefully neutral. "You're not going to like what's in there." The files painted a picture of systematic chaos. Torino's men had infiltrated the hospital weeks before the fire, placing people in key positions, orderlies, security guards, even a nurse in the maternity ward. The fire itself had been a distraction, a way to cover the real crime happening in the confusion. 3 babies went missing that night, Marco continued. Yours was just one of them. The other 2 were found dead within a week, dumped in the harbor. Affiano's hands clenched into fists. And the 3rd? No body ever found. But there's this. Marco slid a photograph across the desk, grainy, black and white, taken by a security camera in the hospital parking lot. It showed a man in surgical scrubs carrying a bundle toward a waiting car. The image was too blurry to make out faces, but the timestamp was clear. 12:23 a.m., 46 minutes after Lucia had died. The car? Registered to a shell company, traced back to Torino's organization. Marco paused. Boss, there's something else. The nurse in the maternity ward, the one working for Torino, she kept records, personal insurance in case things went bad. He produced a small notebook, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was cramped, nervous, but legible. Entry after entry detailing payments received, instructions followed, babies relocated. And there, on the final page, a single line that made Affiano's blood freeze. Calabresi girl delivered to safe house. Payment received. God forgive me. Where? Affiano's voice was barely a whisper. The safe house was abandoned years ago. But the nurse, she's still alive. Living in a convent outside Rome, been there for 20 years. Apparently guilt drove her to God. Affiano stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the harbor. Somewhere out there, Mireia was probably practicing with her vocal coach, working on the scales that would strengthen a voice he now knew carried his DNA. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 23 years building an empire to honor his dead daughter, only to discover she'd been alive all along, growing up in poverty while he accumulated wealth and power. Set up a meeting with the nurse, he said without turning around. Already done. She'll see you tomorrow. And Marco? Affiano's reflection met his lieutenant's eyes in the window glass. This stays between us. No one else knows. Not yet. That evening, Affiano sat in Mireia's apartment, watching her prepare dinner with the focused attention of someone who'd learned not to waste food. She moved efficiently around the small kitchen, humming under her breath. The same melody she'd been singing the day he found her. The same melody Lucia used to sing. You're staring. Again, Mireia said without looking up from the stove. Sorry. Don't apologize. Just tell me what you're thinking about. Affiano studied her profile, noting again the familiar curve of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders when she concentrated. Family, he said finally. Do you have any? Besides the obvious. She gestured vaguely, indicating his organization. I had a wife. She died a long time ago. Children. The question hit him like a physical blow. We were going to, but she died first. Yes? Mireia turned from the stove, her dark eyes soft with sympathy. I'm sorry. That must have been terrible. What about you? He asked, deflecting from his own pain. Do you remember your parents? Something flickered across her face, too quick to interpret, but definitely there. No, I was very young when they died. Car accident, or so I was told. Told by whom? The people who raised me, if you can call it raising. She turned back to the stove, but her movements had become more rigid. Foster families, group homes, the streets, the usual story for unwanted children. You weren't unwanted. The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended. Mireia looked at him sharply, surprised by his vehemence. How could you possibly know that? Because you're mine, he wanted to say. Because I've been looking for you for 23 years, without even knowing you were alive. Because every time you sing, my body recognizes something my mind hasn't caught up to yet. Instead, he said, because no parent gives up a child willingly. Whatever happened to them, I'm sure they loved you. Mireia was quiet for a long moment, stirring the sauce with mechanical precision. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. I used to have dreams about them, When I was little, a woman with dark hair who sang to me, a man with kind eyes who made me feel safe." She paused. "But dreams aren't memories. The social workers always said I was too young to remember anything real." Affiano's chest tightened. Lucia had dark hair, and he'd been told more than once that his eyes were kind, usually by people trying to convince him not to kill them. "Sometimes dreams are the only truth we have," he said softly. After dinner, Mireia sang for him as she always did, but tonight, Affiano paid attention to more than just the relief her voice brought to his throat. He listened to the subtle inflections, the way she shaped certain notes, the unconscious habits that couldn't be taught or learned. They were Lucia's habits. Lucia's voice filtered through 23 years of separation and hardship, but unmistakably hers. When the song ended, Mireia set down her guitar and curled up in her chair, her eyes growing heavy. It had become their routine. She would sing until she was tired, and he would stay until she fell asleep, keeping watch over her dreams. "Affiano?" she said softly, already half asleep. "Yes? Do you think people can be connected without knowing it? Like their souls recognize each other even when their minds don't?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to explore. "I think," he said carefully, "that love finds a way to survive, even when everything else is destroyed." She smiled sleepily. "That's a beautiful thought." As her breathing deepened and her face relaxed into sleep, Affiano reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the DNA test kit. The swab would take only seconds, a gentle brush against the inside of her cheek while she slept. She would never know. But as he looked at her peaceful face, he found himself hesitating. Once he had the results, there would be no going back. No more pretending this was just a strange friendship between a broken man and a gifted girl. The truth would demand action, explanations, a reckoning with 23 years of lies. Was he ready for that? Was she? Affiano put the kit back in his pocket and settled into his chair to keep watch. Tomorrow he would meet with the nurse and learn the final pieces of the puzzle. Tomorrow he would decide whether to shatter the fragile piece they'd built with the weight of truth. But tonight, he would just sit with his daughter and listen to her breathe, grateful for whatever force had brought her voice back to him, even if she didn't know she'd come home. The envelope arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier who didn't make eye contact and left before Affiano could tip him. Dr. Rossi's laboratory had promised discretion, and they'd delivered. No phone calls, no digital records, just a plain manila envelope with results that would either confirm what Affiano's heart already knew or destroy the fragile hope he'd been nurturing for weeks. He sat in his office, the envelope unopened on his desk, while Marco waited in the chair across from him. Outside, Naples hummed with its usual chaos: traffic, voices, the distant sound of construction, normal sounds of a normal day, while Affiano's world balanced on the edge of transformation. "You want me to—" Marco began. "No." Affiano's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the envelope. "This is mine to do." The paper tore easily, revealing a single sheet of laboratory letterhead. Clinical language, percentages, genetic markers, all the scientific terminology that reduced the mystery of human connection to cold mathematics. But at the bottom, in bold type, was the only sentence that mattered. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Affiano stared at the words until they blurred. 23 years of grief, of building monuments to a dead daughter, of carrying guilt like a stone in his chest. And she'd been alive all along, singing on street corners while he accumulated power and wealth in her memory. "Boss?" Marco's voice seemed to come from very far away. Affiano set the paper down carefully, his movements precise and controlled. Inside, though, he was falling apart. Every assumption he'd built his life on was crumbling, replaced by a truth so overwhelming he couldn't process it. Mireia was his daughter, his and Lucia's child, stolen from them in the chaos of fire and violence, raised in poverty while he mourned her death. The voice that opened his throat wasn't just familiar, it was family, calling to him across decades of separation. "Sir, are you—" "Get out." Marco hesitated. "Boss, maybe you should—" "Get out!" The roar echoed off the office walls. Marco left quickly, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Alone, Affiano let the mask fall away. His shoulders shook as 23 years of suppressed grief crashed over him like a tsunami. He'd failed her, failed to protect her, failed to find her, failed to recognize her even when she was right in front of him. What kind of father couldn't recognize his own child's voice? But underneath the grief was something else, a rage so pure and focused it made his vision blur. Torino was dead, had been for 15 years, but his organization still existed. The people who had stolen his daughter, who had condemned her to a life of abandonment and poverty, some of them were still breathing. Not for long. Affiano's phone buzzed, a text from Mireia. "Vocal lesson finished early. Making dinner if you want to join." He stared at the message, trying to reconcile the casual invitation with the earth-shattering truth he now carried. She had no idea. To her, he was still just the strange man who could only drink when she sang, the benefactor who'd given her an apartment and tutors for reasons she didn't fully understand. How do you tell someone their entire life has been a lie? The drive to her apartment passed in a blur. Affiano's mind raced through possibilities, scenarios, ways to break the news that wouldn't destroy her. But every approach felt inadequate. How do you explain to a girl that the father she thought was dead had been searching for her ghost while she lived in ruins? How do you apologize for 23 years of absence? Mireia greeted him at the door with flour in her hair and a smile that made his chest ache. She'd been baking, something she'd never done before the apartment, before the security of knowing where her next meal would come from. "You look terrible," she said, studying his face with concern. "Are you sick?" "No, just tired." She led him to the small kitchen where the scent of fresh bread filled the air, domestic normalcy that felt surreal given what he now knew. This was his daughter, moving around the kitchen with unconscious grace, humming under her breath while she prepared food for the father she didn't recognize. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to the small table. "You need to eat." Affiano obeyed, watching her bustle around the kitchen with the focused attention of someone memorizing every detail. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the small scar on her wrist that he now knew came from an IV inserted during the most traumatic night of both their lives, the unconscious melody she hummed, Lucia's lullaby, passed down through DNA and dreams. "Mireia," he said softly. She didn't look up from the stove. "Do you ever wonder about your parents? Your real parents?" Her movement stilled for just a moment. "Sometimes. But wondering doesn't change anything. They're gone, and I'm here. That's all that matters." What if they weren't gone? What if they'd been looking for you all this time? Now she did turn, her dark eyes, his eyes, searching his face. That's a dangerous game to play. Hope can kill you if you're not careful. But what if it wasn't hope? What if it was fact? Something in his tone made her set down the wooden spoon and face him fully. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Affiano could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of truth pressing against his ribs like a caged bird. "Affiano," she said carefully, "what are you trying to tell me?" He reached into his jacket and withdrew the laboratory report, setting it on the table between them like a bridge across 23 years of separation. Mireia stared at it without moving, as if she could sense its importance without reading the words. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was born during a hospital fire. I thought she died that night, along with her mother. I've spent 23 years mourning her, building my life around the hole she left behind. Mireya's hand moved slowly toward the paper, then stopped. Affiano. Her name was going to be Mireya. Lucia chose it. It means miracle in Spanish. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Mireya's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with an emotion Affiano couldn't read. Fear, hope, disbelief, all tangled together. "You're saying," she began, then stopped. "I'm saying you didn't lose your parents in a car accident. You were stolen from us, taken by my enemies and hidden away while I built an empire on the ashes of my grief." His voice broke. "I'm saying I've been looking for you my whole life without knowing you were alive." Mireya picked up the paper with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the clinical language that reduced their connection to percentages and probabilities. When she finished reading, she set it down carefully and looked at him with an expression that shattered his heart. "You're my father," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact that hung in the air between them like a prayer. "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment, processing the revelation that had just rewritten her entire existence. When she spoke again, her voice was small, lost. "All this time you knew?" "No. I suspected, but I didn't know for certain until today." "The singing. The way you can drink. When I sing. That's why. Your mother used to sing that same lullaby. Your voice. It called to something in me that recognized its own." Mireya stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the street where they'd first met. Her shoulders were rigid, her breathing shallow. Affiano wanted to go to her, to hold her, to somehow bridge the gap of 23 years with a single embrace. But he stayed seated, giving her space to process the truth that had just exploded her world. "They stole me," she said finally, her voice flat with shock. "Yes, and you never stopped looking." "I looked for your body. I thought you were dead." She turned from the window and Affiano saw tears streaming down her face, but her expression wasn't grief. It was rage, pure, focused fury that reminded him of himself. "They stole me from you," she repeated, and this time her voice carried the weight of 23 years of abandonment, of foster homes and group homes and sleeping in ruins. "They made you think I was dead while I grew up believing I was unwanted." Affiano stood slowly, his heart breaking at the pain in her voice. "You were never unwanted, never. I would have moved heaven and earth to find you if I'd known you were alive. But you didn't know. No, and that failure will haunt me for the rest of my life." Mireya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked at him again, something had shifted in her expression. The shock was still there, but underneath it was something else, a fierce determination that made her look exactly like Lucia in her most stubborn moments. "What happens now?" she asked. Affiano moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Now we figure out how to be a family, if you want that." "Do I have a choice?" "You always have a choice. That's the one thing I can promise you. You'll never be powerless again." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he hoped she would find. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said, "but I have questions, lots of questions. I'll answer every one. And I want to know about her, about my mother." Affiano's throat closed, but not from his condition, from the weight of memories he'd kept locked away for decades. "Her name was Lucia," he said, "and she would have loved you more than life itself." As the sun set over Naples, father and daughter sat at the small kitchen table, 23 years of separation stretching between them, like a bridge they would have to build together, one conversation at a time. The bread burned in the oven, forgotten in the wake of truth finally spoken, but neither of them cared. Mireya didn't sing for 3 days. Affiano sat in his office, his throat closing tighter with each passing hour, while his daughter processed the truth that had shattered her world. She'd asked for space, and he'd given it to her, even though every instinct screamed at him to break down her door and demand she let him fix 23 years of damage with words and money and whatever else she needed. But you couldn't buy back stolen time. He was learning that the hard way. "She's not eating," Marco reported on the third day, setting a surveillance photo on Affiano's desk. It showed Mireia sitting by her window, staring out at the street with hollow eyes. "The groceries you sent are still sitting on her counter, untouched." Affiano studied the image, noting the way his daughter held herself. Arms wrapped around her knees, shoulders curved inward like she was trying to disappear. He'd seen that posture before, in the bombed-out building where he'd first found her, the look of someone who'd learned not to expect good things to last. "Any visitors?" "The vocal coach came by yesterday. She didn't answer the door." Affiano closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of failure settle on his chest. He'd spent decades building an empire, commanding respect through fear and violence, but he couldn't figure out how to comfort his own daughter. Every approach felt wrong. Too much, too little, too late. "Boss," Marco said carefully, "maybe you should—" "I know what I should do." Affiano stood, straightening his jacket. "The question is whether she'll let me." The walk to Mireia's apartment felt like a death march. Affiano had faced down rival families, survived assassination attempts, built his reputation on the ability to stay calm under pressure. But climbing those stairs to his daughter's door, he felt like a man walking to his own execution. He knocked, softly. "Mireia? It's me." Silence. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But we need to talk." More silence. Then finally the sound of footsteps. The door opened just wide enough for him to see one dark eye, his eye, staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "I don't want to talk," she said. "Then don't talk. Just listen." She hesitated, then stepped back to let him in. The apartment felt different, colder, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. The guitar sat untouched in its corner, and the kitchen showed no signs of recent use. It was like she'd retreated into herself, shutting down everything that had made this place feel like home. Mireia curled up in her chair, pulling her knees to her chest in that defensive posture he'd seen in the photograph. Affiano sat across from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her clothes hung loose on her already small frame. "You're not eating," he said. "I'm not hungry. You're not singing. I don't feel like it. Mireia, don't." Her voice was sharp, cutting through his attempt at comfort. "Don't sit there and pretend you understand what this feels like. You had a life. You had power, money, respect. You built an empire while I lived in ruins, and now you want to what? Play father? Make up for lost time with tutors and apartments and good intentions?" The words hit him like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. But underneath her anger, he heard something else, pain so deep it made his chest ache. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't understand. I can't. But I'm trying to." "Are you?" She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to turn me into the daughter you lost, the one who died in that fire. But I'm not her, Affiano. I'm not the child you would have raised. I'm the product of 23 years of abandonment and foster homes and sleeping in doorways. You can't just fix that." "I'm not trying to fix you. You're not broken." "Aren't I?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm a girl who grew up believing she was unwanted, who learned to survive by making herself invisible. I don't know how to be someone's daughter. I don't know how to trust that good things won't disappear." Affiano felt something crack inside his chest. "Then we'll learn together." "Will we? Or will you get tired of the reality and go back to mourning the fantasy?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Affiano realized this was the moment that would define everything, not just their relationship, but who he chose to be going forward. He could retreat into the comfortable distance of benefactor and recipient, or he could step into the messy, complicated reality of being a father to a daughter who had every reason not to trust him. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. Mireya's expression didn't change, but she didn't tell him to stop. "I see a girl who survived things that would have broken most people, who kept her voice when everything else was taken from her, who looked at a stranger in an expensive suit and chose kindness over fear." He paused. "I see someone stronger than I ever was at your age, stronger than I am now." "You see what you want to see." "No, I see what's there." Affiano leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. "You think I'm disappointed? You think I wish you were different? Mireya, you're the most remarkable person I've ever met. Not because you're my daughter, but because of who you chose to become, despite everything that was done to you." Something flickered in her expression, surprise maybe, or the beginning of hope. "I failed you," he continued. "I failed to protect you, failed to find you, failed to recognize you even when you were right in front of me. But you didn't fail. You survived. You kept singing. You found your way back to me even when neither of us knew that's what was happening." Mireya was quiet for a long moment, her arms still wrapped around her knees. When she spoke, her voice was small, vulnerable. "I used to dream about this when I was little. I'd imagine my real parents coming to find me, taking me away from whatever horrible place I was living in. But in my dreams, they were perfect. They had good reasons for leaving me. They'd been searching everywhere." She looked at him directly. "The reality is messier, isn't it? Much messier. You're not the father I imagined, and you're not the daughter I mourned. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure out who we actually are instead of who we thought we should be." Mireya unfolded herself slowly, her feet touching the floor. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of believing this is real. Of letting myself hope that I finally have a family, only to lose it again." Affiano stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street where he'd first heard her voice. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't promise I'll always know the right thing to say or do. But I can promise you this: I will never leave you again. Not willingly. Not while there's breath in my body. Even if I'm difficult, even if I don't know how to be the daughter you want." He turned back to her, and for the first time in days, he saw something other than pain in her eyes. Especially then. Mireya stood slowly, moving to where her guitar sat silent in the corner. She picked it up, her fingers finding the strings with the muscle memory of years of practice. "I don't know if I can sing right now," she said. "I don't know if the music will come." "Then don't sing for me. Sing for yourself." She strummed a chord, then another. The melody that emerged was different from anything he'd heard her play before. Sadder, more complex, full of questions that had no easy answers. But it was hers, uniquely and completely hers. As her voice joined the guitar, Affiano felt his throat open for the first time in 3 days. But more than that, he felt something else opening, a space in his heart that had been sealed shut since the night Lucia died. When the song ended, Mireya set down her guitar and looked at him with eyes that held the beginning of trust. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure out how to be a family, the real kind, not the perfect kind." "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I, but we'll learn." For the first time since he'd told her the truth, Mireya smiled. It was small, tentative, but real. "Okay," she said, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "No more secrets. If we're going to do this, we do it honestly. All of it. The good, the bad, the ugly." Affiano nodded, knowing that promise would cost him more than he could imagine. because there were things about his world, his past, his enemies that he'd hoped to keep from her forever. But she was right. If they were going to be a family, it had to be built on truth, even if that truth might destroy them both. The War Council met at dawn. 12 men in expensive suits gathered around a mahogany table that had witnessed decades of blood and betrayal. But this morning, they weren't discussing territory or revenge. They were discussing their boss's apparent descent into madness. "He's shutting down the port operations," Salvatore Ricci said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. 20 million euros a year, gone, just like that. "The protection rackets in Vomero are next," added another voice. "He's calling it restructuring. But we all know what it really is." Marco sat at the far end of the table, saying nothing. He'd been fielding these complaints for weeks, ever since Affiano had started dismantling pieces of his empire with the methodical precision of a man destroying his own legacy. "Where is he?" Ricci demanded. "We need answers." "He's with the girl," Marco said quietly. The silence that followed was loaded with implications. Everyone knew about Mireia, the street singer who'd somehow gained unprecedented influence over their boss. What they didn't know was why, and Affiano's refusal to explain was driving his organization to the breaking point. "This has to stop," Ricci said. "The other families are circling like sharks. They smell weakness." "Then maybe," Marco said, standing slowly, "you should remember who you're talking about. Affiano Calabresi doesn't show weakness. He shows evolution." But even as he defended his boss, Marco felt the weight of doubt pressing down on his shoulders, because the truth was he didn't understand what was happening either. 3 miles away, Affiano sat in Mireia's apartment, watching his daughter practice piano with a focus that reminded him painfully of Lucia. The instrument had been delivered yesterday, a Steinway baby grand that barely fit in the small living room but filled the space with music that made his chest ache with memories. "You don't have to do this," Mireia said without looking up from the keys. She'd been saying variations of the same thing for weeks, ever since he'd started pulling back from the darker aspects of his business. "Do what?" "Burn down your empire for me." Affiano set down his coffee cup, studying her profile in the morning light. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "Isn't it?" She played a complex passage, her fingers dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. "The tutors talk, you know. They hear things about businesses closing, operations shutting down. Your men are scared." "My men are always scared. It keeps them sharp." "This is different." She stopped playing and turned to face him. "They're scared of losing you, and honestly, so am I." The admission hit him harder than any accusation could have. In the month since he'd told her the truth, they'd been building something fragile and precious, a relationship based on honesty rather than fear. But honesty was a luxury he'd never been able to afford in his other life. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Aren't you? Because it feels like you're trying to become someone else. Someone clean, someone worthy of being my father." She stood and moved to the window, her voice growing softer. "But I don't need you to be perfect, Affiano. I need you to be real." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Marco's name on the screen, along with a message that made his blood freeze. "Emergency. They're moving against us. Now." Affiano was on his feet instantly, his mind shifting into the cold, calculating mode that had kept him alive for decades. "I have to go." "What's wrong?" "Business." He was already reaching for his jacket, but Mireia's voice stopped him. "What kind of business?" The question hung between them like a test. For weeks, he'd been trying to shield her from the reality of his world, editing out the violence and brutality that had built his empire. But she'd asked for honesty, and honesty was what she deserved. "The dangerous kind," he said. "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You promised no more secrets." This isn't a secret, this is protection. Mireia crossed her arms, and Affiano saw Lucia's stubborn streak blazing in her dark eyes. You can't have it both ways. Either I'm your daughter and we face things together, or I'm a project you're trying to keep safe. Which is it? The sound of gunfire in the distance made the decision for him. Affiano grabbed Mireia's hand, pulling her toward the door. Stay close to me. Do exactly what I say, and whatever happens, don't let go. The street outside was chaos. 3 black SUVs had surrounded the music studio, and men in tactical gear were taking positions behind cars and doorways. Affiano recognized the coordinated precision. This wasn't a random attack. This was a coup, carefully planned and expertly executed. Ricci, he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. Who's Ricci? Mireia asked, her voice steady despite the danger. Someone who thinks he can take what's mine. They moved quickly through the back alleys, Affiano's hand never leaving Mireia's as he navigated the maze of narrow streets he'd known since childhood. Behind them, the gunfire intensified, and he could hear shouting in the distance, his men fighting for their lives while he ran like a coward. But he wasn't running for himself. He was running for her. There, he said, pointing to a small cafe that looked closed, but whose owner owed him favors. We can... The bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a brick wall. Pain exploded through his body, but his first thought wasn't for himself. It was for Mireia, who was staring at the blood spreading across his white shirt with wide, terrified eyes. Papa. The word came out as a whisper, and Affiano realized it was the first time she'd called him that. I'm okay, he lied, pressing his hand against the wound, but we need to move. More gunfire erupted from the street behind them. Ricci's men were getting closer, and Affiano knew they had minutes at most before they were cornered. He thought of all the times he'd been in situations like this, all the enemies he'd faced down with nothing but cold calculation and superior firepower. But this time was different. This time, he had something to lose. Listen to me, he said, gripping Mireia's shoulders with his good hand. There's a church 3 blocks from here. San Giuseppe, go there, find Father Antonio, tell him Affiano sent you. He'll keep you safe. I'm not leaving you. You have to. No. Her voice was fierce, determined. You said we face things together. You promised. Affiano looked at his daughter, really looked at her. The fear in her eyes, yes, but also something else. Strength, courage, the same fire that had kept her alive on the streets for years. Okay, he said, together, but we do this my way. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text to Marco. Bring everyone. End this. Then he took Mireia's hand and led her deeper into the maze of alleys, moving with the predatory grace of a man who'd spent his life hunting and being hunted. Behind them, the sounds of war echoed off the ancient stones of Naples. But for the first time in decades, Affiano Calabresi wasn't fighting for power or territory or respect. He was fighting for family, and that made him more dangerous than he'd ever been. You don't have to burn the world for me, Mireia said as they reached the relative safety of a hidden courtyard. Affiano looked at her, this remarkable girl who'd somehow become the center of his universe, and smiled despite the pain in his shoulder. I'm not burning it for you, he said. I'm burning it for us. The war for his empire could wait. Right now, all that mattered was keeping his daughter safe and showing her that some things, some people, were worth any sacrifice, even if it cost him everything he'd spent his life building. The safe house overlooked the Bay of Naples, its windows facing east toward the sunrise that painted the water gold each morning. Affiano had owned the property for 15 years, but never lived in it. Until now, when living anywhere else would have meant death for both him and his daughter. 3 weeks had passed since Ricci's coup attempt. 3 weeks since Marco and the loyal remnants of Affiano's organization had painted the streets red with the blood of traitors. The war was over, but the victory felt hollow. Half his empire lay in ruins, his remaining men scattered to the winds, and the other families were already moving to claim the territory he could no longer hold. But as he sat at the small kitchen table, watching Mireia hum while she prepared breakfast, Affiano found he didn't care about any of it. "Your shoulder's healing well," she said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. The bullet wound had left him with limited mobility in his left arm, but the pain was manageable now. "Dr. Benedetti says you'll have full range of motion back within a month." "Good." Affiano picked up his fork with his right hand, still adjusting to the awkwardness of eating one-handed. "Though I'm not sure what I'll need it for." Mireia sat across from him, her dark eyes studying his face with the intensity she'd inherited from both her parents. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" The question didn't surprise him. His daughter had developed an unsettling ability to read his thoughts, as if 23 years of separation had created a psychic connection between them. "The idea has merit," he admitted. "There's nothing left for us here. Too many enemies, too few allies. We could disappear. New identities, new lives. I have accounts in Switzerland, properties in places where no one would think to look. Running away. Strategic withdrawal." Mireia smiled at that, the expression transforming her face from serious to radiant. "You can dress it up in fancy words, but it's still running away. Sometimes running away is the smartest thing you can do, and sometimes it's the most cowardly." Affiano set down his fork, studying his daughter's face. In the weeks since the attack, she'd changed. The frightened girl who'd watched him bleed in an alley had been replaced by someone harder, more determined. Someone who looked at the world with eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop pretending you're not who you are." Mireia leaned forward, her voice growing more intense. "You're Affiano Calabresi. You built an empire from nothing, survived wars that killed better men, commanded respect through 3 decades of violence and strategy. And now you want to what? Become a suburban father who drives me to piano lessons? Would that be so terrible?" "It would be a lie." She reached across the table and took his good hand in both of hers. "I don't need you to be someone else. I need you to be you. All of you, including the parts that scare people." Affiano felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd been carrying since the day he'd told her the truth. "You don't understand what that means. The things I've done, the enemies I've made. I understand perfectly." Her grip on his hand tightened. "I understand that you're a man who does terrible things for good reasons, who built his life on violence but never forgot how to love, who spent 23 years mourning a daughter he thought was dead, and when he found her alive, was willing to burn down everything he'd built to keep her safe." "Mireia, I'm not finished." Her voice carried an authority that reminded him painfully of Lucia. "I also understand that running away won't solve anything. Your enemies will still be out there. The families will still be fighting over your territory. And somewhere, in some hospital or orphanage or foster home, there are other children being stolen from their parents the way I was stolen from you." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, maybe it's time to stop running from who you are and start using it for something better." Before Affiano could respond, his phone buzzed, Marco's name on the screen along with a message that made his blood freeze. "Torino's nephew is moving against the Benedetti family. 3 children missing. Thought you should know." Affiano stared at the message, feeling the familiar rage building in his chest. Torino was dead, but his legacy lived on in a nephew who'd inherited his uncle's taste for cruelty and his methods of psychological warfare. "What is it?" Mireia asked, reading his expression. Affiano showed her the message. She read it twice, her face growing pale, then set the phone down with hands that trembled slightly. "Children," she said. "Yes." "Like me?" "Yes." Mireia stood and walked to the window that overlooked the bay. The morning sun painted her profile in gold, and for a moment she looked exactly like Lucia. Beautiful, fierce, unbreakable. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked without turning around. "Nothing. It's not my fight anymore." "Isn't it?" She turned to face him, and Affiano saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Those children have parents who are going through what you went through, thinking their babies are dead, mourning them, building their lives around the hole they left behind. And somewhere, those children are growing up the way I grew up, believing they're unwanted, unloved, forgotten. Mireia, you don't understand. I understand that you have the power to stop it. The knowledge, the connections, the resources. You could find those children and bring them home. At what cost? The moment I surface, every enemy I've ever made will come for us, for you. Then we make sure we're ready for them. Affiano stared at his daughter, seeing in her face the same determination that had driven him to build an empire from nothing. But where his motivation had been revenge and power, hers was something purer: justice, protection, the fierce love of someone who'd been lost and found her way home. "You're asking me to go to war," he said. "I'm asking you to be my father, the real one, the one who doesn't run from fights that matter." Affiano was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the rewards, the cost against the necessity. Then he reached for his phone and dialed Marco's number. "It's me," he said, when his lieutenant answered. "Gather the men, all of them. We have work to do." "Boss? I thought you were—" "I was wrong. Some things are worth fighting for." He hung up and looked at Mireia, who was watching him with eyes that shone with pride and love, and something that might have been hope. "Together?" she asked. "Together." As the sun climbed higher over the Bay of Naples, Affiano Calabresi reached for the glass of water that sat beside his breakfast plate. He lifted it to his lips and drank deeply, the liquid flowing down his throat smooth and easy, without the crushing weight of guilt that had sealed him shut for so long. For the first time in his life, he was drinking without fear, not because his daughter was singing, but because she was sitting across from him, planning their next move, with the strategic mind she'd inherited from both her parents. He wasn't just a Mafia boss anymore. He wasn't just a father. He was both, and that made him more dangerous than he'd ever been. The war for his soul was over. The war for justice was just beginning, and this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. If this story moved you, don't just watch in silence. Subscribe now, because the next story will be darker, more dangerous, and far more emotional than anything you've seen so far. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? I want to know who this story found across the world. Your comments bring these stories to life, and your support keeps them alive. Now stay with me, because tomorrow's story will change everything.